Right.
Hmm.
Okay, guys, here we go. The guests are coming fast and furious this week. Today we've got the lovely Max Abrams, who's a assistant professor at Northeastern University. So you can feel the pain of my living in the frozen tundra because you're probably experiencing something similar. How you doing, Max?
I'm doing well. This impending storm is could shape up to be a real crazy one. And you're
I
right. The more south you go, the worse it gets. So that's
Right.
unusual.
So maybe I'll experience a bit of Schadenfreude if you guys get it and we could for once escape it so I could look down on you Southerners and rejoice at
Uh,
not having gotten it. Maybe we'll see. So you're an expert, I mean, you're a professor of political science, but your specialty, or at least one of your specialties, is to study various facets of terrorism. So my feeling is that we'll spend much of our chat today talking about this. First, maybe you could tell us about, people are interested in terms of how do academics end up choosing their areas of specialties or specialization. What was it in your case that led you to say, this is what I want to dedicate my time studying?
well, it's a funny. Uh,
Oh,
uh,
you're,
I'm
you're,
the
you're, you're sorry, you're freezing.
hmm,
Take it again. Take it again.
okay. So it's a funny story. I graduated from my undergraduate university, University of Pennsylvania, in 2000. And, at the University of Pennsylvania, the big focus is Wharton and, finances and
Right.
economics. And this was 2000. So all my friends, they went off to Wall Street and they made a killing. And they said to me, what are you doing? You're missing out. What is all this political science nonsense? And I went to Oxford. It's a 2-year program from 2000 to 2002. And in the year 2000, I proposed doing my thesis about some aspect of terrorism. And I was told by the Oxford professors that actually terrorism is not a suitable topic within the field of international relations, and that I would have real difficulty finding a suitable advisor.
Why? Before you go on, or are you gonna mention why he said that?
Sure. I
Okay.
mean, the main paradigm in international relations at that time was realism. It's called realism. And realism is all about conflict between states, not challenges to them from below, especially great power conflict. The paradigm really emerged in the context of the Cold War to explain, bipolarity, etc. So in between year 1 and 2, I went back to visit my family in Connecticut over the summer, which extended through the month of September. And then 9/11 happened. I returned to Oxford, and I was suddenly told there's no better place to study terrorism than
Right.
Oxford University.
Right. Nice.
So, I mean, I could go on. Basically, Oxford was very politically left leaning. This was at a time when many Americans post 9/11 were feeling politically more, to the right. There was a big uptick in support, for example, in the immediate aftermath of the attacks for President Bush. There were flags all over the place. And I didn't really have that much tolerance.
You're breaking up. You're breaking up. Sorry. Say again. You broke up.
Yeah, so I really didn't have that much tolerance for constant criticisms of Americans and U.S. foreign policy, etc. So right after Oxford in 2002, I joined up with a right center think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
Right.
And at that time, the big foreign policy discussion was over the Iraq War.
Mm.
And although the Iraq War is often described as, led by George W. Bush and the neocons, and there is some truth to that. The reality, though, is that within Washington, D.C., the policy community was broadly behind going into Iraq. Colin Powell from the State Department made the big sell. Hillary Clinton of the Democrats, was also instrumental. Ken Pollack at the Left Center, Brookings Institute, wrote a powerful book in favor essentially of intervention. And so what I found was the real debate was not so much between George W. Bush and other, elements of the policy community, but really the debate was between the policy community and academics who tended to oppose the Iraq War. And so at the time in 2003, I was a little bit less gray, and I said to myself, all right, well, this will be an interesting sort of battleground to determine my personal future, because I'm going to observe who was right, essentially. Was it the policy community or was it the academics? And basically, the Iraq War quickly turned south. Many of the core predictions of the policy analysts who claimed to know Iraq best got it wrong. Of course, there were not these transnational terrorist ties, with Saddam. There were no WMD. We basically misunderstood Saddam's motives and his relations with Iran in particular. Certainly, post-war occupation was anything but a cakewalk. And so I decided after all that to go back and get my PhD, to go more sort of the academic track, if you will, but to nonetheless continue studying policy relevant issues, especially terrorism, but from a university.
Nice. Good. Thank you for that good summary. So now you've written, or in the last few years, you've written sort of two tracks when studying terrorism. One has been to explore motives of terrorism, while the other one has been to explore the efficacy of terrorism as a strategy. And I'll have a lot to say about the motives part, and we may perhaps disagree on some of that stuff. So maybe you could briefly describe both of these tracks, in a few,
Sure.
quick sentences.
Well, okay, you've clearly done your homework. I don't actually view them, though, as separate tracks. I view all of my research as very tightly interrelated. The dominant paradigm, which I've basically labeled as the strategic model, makes three main assertions. First, that terrorism is an effective tactic to pressure governments into making political concessions. Secondly, that groups adopt terrorism precisely because it's so effective in pressuring governments into making these concessions. And third, that the key to combating terrorism is therefore to divest terrorism of its political utility in order to make terrorism less attractive as a political instrument. So, for example, some people favor democracy promotion to enable people to peacefully address their political problems without resorting to terrorism, or people favor the peace process in order to convince the terrorists that they're better off politically to enter negotiations than to blow up civilians. And so when you think about it, the strategic model is really predicated on this first core assumption that terrorism is indeed politically effective behavior at pressuring governments into making concessions, and that's why its perpetrators do it. Although the strategic model is believed by many, many academics and policymakers, people in the media and in the general public, in grad school, I set out to really scrutinize this core assumption to determine whether indeed it's true that blowing up million targets is a good way to soften up countries into becoming more politically conciliatory.
And let me guess, it's not.
It is not, indeed, it's not.
I could have predicted that for you, and I didn't have to run those studies.
Well, this is very often the case, is that observers actually are more correct about terrorism than those who claim to be experts on the subject. So I am not at all surprised.
Before you go on, because just so that we can have sort of a flowing chat, I can't remember who it was who said it. I think it might have been Gaddafi, but I think it's been picked up in various forms by different Islamic thinkers. And so I'm going to sort of paraphrase the general idea. So let's go with it's Gaddafi, and then we could check later if that's correct or not.
Sure.
So I think he had said that, look, we're not, terrorism and violence is a distraction, right? That's not how you bring down the West. The way you bring down the West, the way you conquer the West, is through three means. Number one, through the womb of our women, okay, right? Demography. Number two, through hijra. Hijra in Arabic means through immigration. And we know from the starting point of Islam, when Muhammad went from Mecca to Medina, there is this concept of sort of holy hijra. And that's what we're seeing now with this mass migration patterns. And then thirdly, it's by using your miserable freedoms against you. And so just if you understood those three concepts, you would have very quickly realized that they're exactly correct, that terrorism is really just a small, painful, the people who die from terrorism don't think it's a trivial, strategy. But in the grand sort of civilizational battle, I agree that terrorism doesn't do much. What do you think of that?
It really, you could look at, the effects of terrorism in all sorts of different ways. You could look at the economic effects. You could look at the ability of terrorism to generate media attention. You could look at how much fear it causes in the public. And a lot of people think that of terrorism in this fashion, and because they do, they inevitably arrive at the conclusion that terrorism is indeed very, very effective. Indeed, it has a 100% success rate because that's the very definition of terrorism. That it's violence, that it uses the media and basically has an oversized impact in terms of making people afraid. So sure, if we define terrorism in that way, then it's very successful. But, think back to the Cold War. People were concerned at the time, not just about the direct physical costs of, say, a Soviet nuclear attack in Western Europe, but also whether Europe would go red.
Right.
Would the Soviets basically be able to impose their political preferences on the rest of the world? And so a lot of my work focuses on the political impact of terrorism. Specifically, whether the terrorists are indeed able to pressure governments into adopting, the group's official political platform. And what I find is that actually terrorism is very, very highly correlated with political failure. The vast majority of terrorist groups do not end up achieving their stated political goals. And this is true around the world going back into history. And secondly, and perhaps more interestingly, is that I've managed to use statistics and other, more advanced methodologies to show that all else equal, when groups use terrorism by attacking civilian targets, which is the way most of us define terrorism, it actually lowers the odds of government concessions. And so the reason why terrorists are failing at such a high political rate is actually inherent to the tactic of terrorism itself. It's not simply because, terror weapon of the weak, and so they're too weak to achieve their goals. Or it's not just because terrorists very often have strategies that governments are loath to adopt. It's all else equal, blowing up civilian targets like movie theaters or markets or schools actually hardens governments from making political concessions. And so this gets to what I call the puzzle of terrorism, which is why would seemingly rational people adopt terrorism if it actually has a negative political return?
Let me interject here, because there's a similar discussion of rationality that happens within some of my areas of research. So I was trained in psychology of decision making. And of course, as you may or may not know, I now apply evolutionary psychology in consumer behavior. So if you could imagine, there are really sort of two driving themes in my research: studying decision making, and then usually using the lens of evolutionary theory to inform our understanding of human behavior. But if we go back to psychology of decision making, the rational model in decision making, which of course is probably also relevant to what you do, is this idea of rational man, Homo economicus, right? For example, in the context of financial decision making, you choose that alternative which maximizes your utility. So these are normative models of how people ought to behave if they adhered to this fanciful notion of rationality. But of course, in reality, as a psychologist, I know, and as a behavioral scientist, I know that that idealized version of human behavior is very removed from what people actually do, right? So there's a big tension between what the economists tell us we should do as rational actors and what people actually do. So in that sense, when you say, oh, well, this is what the terrorists should do if they were following, sort of, if they were rational agents, well, could it not be simply because the benchmark of rationality that we're imposing on them is actually an erroneous one? Do you follow what I'm asking?
I absolutely do. I think that it's useful to maintain the rationality assumption, but to recognize that rationality can play out in all sorts of different ways. The problem with the strategic model, in my opinion, is not so much that terrorists are irrational, but that they're surprisingly apolitical. So it is actually rational for people to join up with Islamic State, for example, for foreign jihadis to go there, but not in order to, achieve some, fanciful, caliphate throughout the world. But it's perfectly rational, let's say, for some guy who's unemployed, who doesn't really have a bright future, who can't really get any women, who's attracted to violence and wants to join up with some group that he perceives as being meaningful, to go on an adventure. And so this is why, a lot of people are attracted to this propaganda, because they have nothing to do. For them, it might be exciting to travel to a foreign land, maybe to act violently, to appear like they're some sort of a star, maybe to rape Yazidi women. If that's the incentive structure of these guys, then what they're doing is not irrational. It's just not that political.
Let me interject. Very good, because that kind of leads us to the motives, the psychological motives of the terrorists. So I agree that many of the motives that you mentioned are driving those folks. And before I explain why I agree with it, but then I also think that we need to incorporate the doctrinal element. I'll do that in a second. So, but let me draw an analogy. So in evolutionary, and bear with me as I sort of build the argument. In evolutionary theory, there's a distinction between what are called proximate explanations and ultimate explanations. Proximate explanations is where much of science lives. It explains the how and what of a phenomenon, right? So if you want to understand pregnancy sickness, why women get, morning sickness and pregnancy sickness, you could study how their fluctuating rates of hormones affect the severity of their symptoms. That's a proximate question, and that's perfectly fine. If you ask the ultimate question, the Darwinian why, which is why would women have evolved pregnancy sickness as a mechanism? And it turns out it's because you want to protect the growing fetus from certain food pathogens. So without getting into more details, both of these explanations, the proximate explanation and the ultimate explanation, is needed so that together we now have a full epistemological account of the phenomenon that we're studying. So now let's link it to what you're saying, or what's also famously a guy like Scott Atran has said. Yes, it is true that these guys join ISIS for male bonding and thrill-seeking and for sexual conquest. And those are all true. But of course, there are tons of men who also desire those pursuits who are not joining ISIS. The reason why guys from 80 different countries that are very different in terms of their races and ethnicities and cultures are joining this one group is because they do get a doctrinal coverage. Right? They're not all fans of the Boston Bruins. They're not all fans of Manchester City. It is precisely because they could unite, rightly or wrongly, around a religious cause that allows them to then pursue all these other earthly desires. So I think that, so I'm not against what Scott Atran might say or what you might say, but what worries me, and I'm not saying that you do this, is that a lot of, especially academics, but some public policy folks, simply never want to link it to the religious element. So I'll put later at the bottom of our clip 2 exchanges, breathtaking exchanges, and I'm just going to look here who they are, between Representative Dan Lundgren, who was questioning at one point Paul Stockton, the Assistant Defense Secretary for Homeland Security. And he was trying to get him to admit that it has something to do with Islam. And then the other incredible exchange was between Representative Lamar Smith questioning Attorney General Eric Holder, where both of these very powerful men who are entrusted with protecting folks could simply not utter the words. That's a problem. What are your thoughts on all this?
I do think that there is a tendency to minimize the role of religion to explain groups like Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. I think that there are different reasons for why different kinds of groups tend to minimize religion. In the case of policymakers, especially on the left, what they want to emphasize is that that basically the solution to this kind of radicalism is actually the international Muslim community. And so therefore they downplay the Islamist elements in order to be more attractive in terms of eliciting the support of Muslim allies. So it's largely instrumental, right? In the case of academics, I think it's more pedagogical, if you will. Certainly within political science, the dominant other field, which has really altered the way political scientists think, is economics. And in economics, the preferences of the actors are, taken as exogenous. It's really a big focus. There's just a general assumption that the goal is, profit maximization or something. So we believe in this sense of rationality without really getting into the unique preferences of the international actors, which may go a long way to explaining their behavior. So there's really a long tradition, both among policymakers and academics, to minimize the Islamist component of the contemporary terrorism threat.
That's a very interesting dichotomy, because I see it in my own if you like, scientific reality, but in a completely different context. So I, if you like, I founded the field of evolutionary consumption, the idea of incorporating evolutionary psychology within the study of consumer behavior. And since there have been several people that have come in at this nexus. And for the first 15 years or so, there was an incredible amount of hostility towards my work, and there still is, amongst social scientists who did not appreciate the fact that humans are biological beings, right? So in academia, and certainly in the social sciences, there's this mantra that what makes you human is that you transcend your biology, right? So biology is relevant to explaining the behavior of the mosquito and the hyena and the falcon, but don't you dare apply these same evolutionary principles to explain human behavior. We transcend our biology. We're cultural animals. And so typically when I have faced blowback from fellow academics who were not, evolutionists, it's because I was going up against some of their most cherished sort of first base assumptions about human nature. On the other hand, practitioners, so if I give a talk and there are a lot of advertisers in the room or practicing marketers, then they would listen to my talk about how much of what we do in consumer behavior is driven by our biology, and they would say, yeah, great, beautiful stuff. So here you had the practitioners who were perfectly fine with listening to my message, whereas the academics who are entrenched in their paradigms, and if I'm right, they feel that their paradigm will be threatened, they're the ones who are building the defenses. So in a similar way to how you sort of created this dichotomy between the public policymakers and the academics, I have faced a similar dichotomy, if you'd like.
There are also different sort of disciplinary views in terms of the rationality of terrorists. So as I was suggesting, economists and political scientists tend to hold very dearly to this assumption that the terrorists are rational. And I sort of come from that school of thought as a political scientist. But if you look, there are many, people, many different disciplines who focus on terrorism, not just political scientists and economists. If you look, for example, at the research of criminologists, they're much more likely to look at sort of the cognitive, mental limitations
Right.
of many terrorists, especially when you bear down at the individual level and you're not talking so much about the behavior of the terrorist organizations more broadly.
Right.
But perhaps at the, looking at the lone wolf actors and recognizing that they disproportionately suffer from all sorts of pre-existing mental disorders. So criminologists are quite sympathetic to this idea that we may be dealing with fundamentally irrational foes.
Right, got you. But incidentally, and we can certainly carry on this discussion offline, there is a stream of folks who care about rationality, but who root rationality within an evolutionary understanding of the human mind. So rather than talking about rationality as we've been talking so far, sort of this normative rationality of rational man or Homo economicus, there are definitions of rationality such as ecological rationality or deep rationality that actually looks at what would constitute a rational agent once we have a better understanding of how evolution has shaped the human mind. So there is a way to speak about rationality, but whilst also moving away from this sort of very normative, stylized version of what constitutes rationality. Let me give you a very quick example. So Gerd Gigerenzer, are you familiar at all? Does that name ring a bell? Gerd Gigerenzer is a German psychologist who really pioneered the work of this idea of ecological rationality. And so he talks about fast and frugal heuristics, right? The idea that when we make decisions, we make these fast and cognitively frugal heuristic decisions because we can't sit there and do the utility maximization function, right? So, for example, if I give you, and here's one example.
It sounds a little bit like Herbert Simon's, satisficing.
Right, exactly. So, bounded rationality of Herbert Simon, which was kind of trying to create a boundary condition on the more strict rational model, but Herb Simon did not use the language and the lens of evolutionary theory to then, redefine his notion of rationality. But you're exactly right. By the way, I've got a signed, autographed copy of Herb Simon's autobiography in my university office. And I even have a memo from my doctoral supervisor, which I've kept. And the title of the memo is something like, comments about, our work from Herb Simon. Because my supervisor and Herb Simon knew each other well. So that's my claim to fame when it comes to Herb Simon. Fantastic guy.
That's very cool.
But so I was going to mention just one example of a fast and frugal heuristic. So Gigerenzer and his colleagues had looked at something known as the recognition heuristic, right? So simply choose that which you recognize, right? Well, that's a very fast and frugal strategy. So now, how did they test that? So you take a bunch of companies that you might want to invest in financially. And you, on the one hand, you use some incredibly fancy mathematical model to come up with the optimal strategy for how you should choose these different, your portfolio. On the other hand, the naive strategy, the fast and frugal strategy, is simply go through the list of companies and only pick the ones that you recognize. Oh, Coca-Cola, I recognize. Right? GoPro, I recognize. Gentech, I don't, I won't. And it turns out that this profoundly naive strategy performs as well, if not better, than the unbelievably sophisticated one. So here's an example where...
That's why advertising works.
There you go. So, cut through all the computational complexity and you could still arrive at an optimal decision. So I think, certainly given the work that you do, you might want to check out some of that work because I think it would marry itself very nicely to some of the stuff that you're doing.
I've actually proposed and tested my own cognitive heuristic, if you will.
Okay.
That relates to terrorism, which your listeners might find interesting. I basically call it the correspondence of means and ends bias.
Okay.
And basically, the bias is that people tend to infer the extremeness of an international actor's intentions based on the extremeness of the international actor's tactics. And so, for example, it's possible, at least in theory, for somebody to have very moderate tactics, but really extreme, political preferences. For example, you might see some guy on the side of the road with a sign, holding it up saying, let's have a communist revolution in this democratic country. That's a very moderate tactic, but a rather extreme political preference to have. Alternatively, in theory, you could have a group that uses very extreme tactics, but for a relatively moderate goal, like hostage takers shooting somebody in the head unless they transfer, say, 25 cents into his bank account, which would be a relatively moderate goal. And so what I postulate and have actually tested in a experiment, a survey experiment on a large representative sample of Americans, is that Americans tend to infer the extremeness of an international actor's political goals based on the extremeness of the actor's tactics. And so basically what I did was I created two separate vignettes, which were presented randomly over the internet. And in one of them, this unknown group expresses a moderate goal and then uses moderate tactics to achieve it, like a nonviolent protest. In the other vignette, you have the same unknown group expressing the same moderate goals, but I substitute the moderate, nonviolent protest tactics for terrorism. And what I find is that when respondents see that this unknown actor with presumed moderate, political preferences uses such an extreme tactic of terrorism, Americans conclude that, the stated moderate goals of this actor are not true, that this actor actually harbors very extreme political preferences. And so therefore, we shouldn't negotiate with them. We should go on the offensive and not make political concessions. We can't trust them to bargain with, etc. And I've invented this cognitive heuristic, the correspondence of means and end bias, in order to try to explain why terrorists have such a poor political track record.
Right,
And so one of the main reasons why is terrorists inherently suffer a credibility problem. Right. Target countries do not think that if they negotiate with the terrorists, that it will appease them. And this is because we tend to conclude that their policy preferences must be so extreme by dint of their extreme tactics.
Gotcha. So let me summarize what you just said in simpler terms and see if I got what you said. So because people succumb to the bias that you just described, that causes them, the countries in question, to overreact to the terrorists, who then end up failing in their political, objectives, precisely because there's this overreaction that comes from the nation in question, right? Is that roughly right?
I mean, I'll give a concrete example. Bin Laden, for example, he said to the United States, well, he was a big talker. He said a whole lot of different things.
Right. Oh, you're frozen.
Oh.
Start again, because you were frozen for about 5 seconds. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I'll give a concrete example. Yeah. Bin Laden said that if the United States doesn't get out of the Middle East, that the United States will be terrorized by Al-Qaeda. And instead, we did the exact opposite. We increased our troop presence in the Persian Gulf by a factor of 15.
Right.
And one of the reasons why we did that is because we didn't believe Bin Laden. We thought that, because he used such extreme tactics in taking down the World Trade Center, that this is not exactly a guy that we should be negotiating with. Instead, we need to preemptively kill him.
Right. Beautiful. So now we're almost, I know that you have to go, so we're gonna try to wrap it up soon. Let's see if we can marry some of my interests with some of yours. There is a field which you may or may not be familiar with, known as biopolitics or evolutionary politics. Does that ring a bell or not really?
I study politics, and I am very interested in evolutionary psychology
Oh,
and
very nice.
theories. I read, early on in high school, I read Robert Wright's The Moral Animal.
Sure, sure, of
And
course.
that really had a deep impact on how I understand life.
Not
But I tend in my work not to marry the two, and I'm certainly not an expert on the bio side.
So I was going to say that when I wrote a paper back in 2003, it was published in an edited book by, I'm going on memory, Al Summit and Steve Peterson, who are two of the best, most well-known political scientists who are sort of biologically inspired. And I had written an article or a book chapter on how you might use evolutionary psychology in the context of political marketing. Uh, so, for example, the fact that there are certain cues that we look for in politicians that, again, we're using these fast and frugal heuristics, for example, the height of a politician or certain facial features that assort along dominance, for example. So these are some of the ways by which you can infuse some aspects of political science with a biological lens. Now, there's a guy whom you definitely want to check out, and I think at some point I'll need to invite him on the show. His name is James Fowler. He's a UCSD political scientist. And not only does he apply evolutionary theory in general, but then he also looks at genetics and how that affects things like political preferences. So I'm wondering if, based on, I know that this is not your area, but do you see an increased infusion of biological ideas within political science, or is it still pretty much maybe a few guys, but the rest of the world happily ignores biology as relevant to the study of political science?
I think it's more the latter.
Okay.
This James Fowler you're talking about is
Yes.
a scholar.
You're breaking up. Say again what you just said about James Fowler.
James Fowler is a very eminent scholar in political
Right.
science. I hope you get him on your show. I'll definitely listen in.
Well, you should listen to all my shows, whether he's on or not. But go ahead.
No, he's a very special
Yeah,
scholar.
he's
In
fantastic.
particular, in general, I would say that biology isn't completely ignored within political science. I mean, there are just certain basic assumptions. For example, some aspects of realism attribute violence to, quote unquote, human nature.
Right.
But it's not really scientifically
Right.
fleshed out in any way. In general, we have very stylized views of man, and we, assume rationality largely to keep our models simple and to make very clear, non-noisy predictions.
But wait, and maybe that's how we could end it. I'll say this. There is a very, very nice distinction, and I talk about this in some of my lectures, between three views of decision making. So there is normative decision making, which is what we've been talking about, sort of this stylized norm of rational man. Then there is prescriptive decision making. So prescriptive decision making is there's in operations research or in management science. You need to optimize some function. So what is the decision-making mechanism that would optimize that goal? And so, for example, the traveling salesman problem is a classic example from operations research. You have a salesman that has to start at city A, and he has to go through cities B, C, D, and E, and he could only go through each once without going back. What should be the optimal route that he takes to visit each city once whilst minimizing some cost, let's say fuel costs or travel costs or whatever it is. And now to solve that problem, you actually use a mathematical algorithm from operations research that allows you to prescribe the optimal decisions to take. And then you've got descriptive decision making. Descriptive decision making doesn't care about normative norms, doesn't care about prescribing. It says, I don't care about these things. I want to describe actual behavior. This is where guys like me live, right? So I don't care about your rational man. I don't care about optimizing. I'd like to know, how do people choose their mates? How do people choose their political leaders? How do people choose products? Just describe the cognitive process. And I think oftentimes, even though these three can, of course, coexist, you get frictions between them because the starting point of what each camp is trying to do is very, very different. Any sort of thoughts on this?
Well, I think that general approach speaks to me because I do consider myself to be a terrorism theorist, but I'm also very much an empiricist. And so I believe that theories must be empirically accurate. So I'm constantly
You broke up. Sorry.
So I'm constantly
Yeah.
looking at terrorism theories and basically trying to find their limitations in terms of which ones are right, which ones are wrong, and then adjusting the theory to make it more capture actual reality. And so some of my models do a better job of
Some of your
behavior.
you're breaking up. Some of your models. Try again. Sorry, guys. Sorry, viewers.
So my models do a much better job of predicting actual terrorist behavior than the conventional wisdom, precisely because I do take theory seriously, but the theory should be consistent with the reality.
Right.
So I look at terrorist incidents throughout the world over time using all sorts of different data sets in order to make more accurate predictions about all sorts of aspects about terrorism. Will governments make concessions? Will groups claim credit for their attacks? Which kinds of groups will attack which targets? These are the kinds of things I've made a lot of progress on.
Beautiful. Okay, that sounds great. Any things that you'd like to promote in terms of? I mean, of course, I'll put up your university website, maybe your Twitter handle. Is there anything else that folks should be aware of in terms of your professional work?
Sure. So in a recent paper with my colleague Philip Potter at the University of Virginia, we developed a model that can explain when groups are more or less likely to attack civilian targets. And what we find is that the more decentralized the decision-making process within the organization, that is, the less influence the leadership has over the rank and file in terms of their tactical choices, the more likely the group is to blow up civilian targets rather than military ones. And what we're going to see...
You're frozen.
That increasingly, as Islamic State comes under duress in Iraq and in Syria, and as the leadership is forced to delegate tactical decision-making more geographically all over the world, that these affiliates and that these people inspired by Islamic State are going to be more likely to attack civilian targets. This is basically a pattern that we've found across hundreds of different groups. So I would expect to see more civilian targeting. And furthermore, another one of my main conclusions over the years is that civilian targeting tends to evoke a huge international response, that nobody really likes civilian targeting. And so the anti-Islamic State coalition will continue to grow, and Islamic State ultimately will be a lot less politically successful than many people presume.
Very interesting. Hey, Max, this was fantastic. Really enjoyed it. I'm sure we'll stay in touch. Have a great weekend. Stay on the line. I'm going to stop the recording. Talk to you soon.